A villa outside Rome. The year is 65 AD. Late afternoon. The kind of light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. A man sits in a warm bath. He is 69 years old. His hands are steady. A scribe sits nearby, still writing, because the man has not stopped talking. He is dying, in the only sense that choice was available to him this morning. The emperor sent soldiers with a message. The message did not require a response. It required a decision. He had written about this moment for 40 years. He had written all of it, believed most of it, lived up to some of it, and failed at parts of it in ways he documented with more honesty than most people apply to their successes. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Born in a provincial city far from Rome, rose to become one of the most influential unofficial voices in the empire, accumulated great wealth while writing about simplicity, counselled an emperor who became a murderer, tried to leave and was not permitted to leave. The question his life raises has never been answered cleanly. Was he a philosopher or a hypocrite? The answer, as we will find, is that the question itself needs to be examined before it can be answered. Settle in. Let the day go quiet. This is the complete life of Seneca. Chapter 1. The world he was born into. To understand Seneca, start with what he was not. He was not Roman by birth. He did not grow up in the shadow of the Forum or inherit his future from the city that distributed futures to almost everyone who mattered in the 1st century AD. He was born in Cordoba, the provincial capital of Hispania Baetica, in what is now the Andalusia region of southern Spain. Sometime around 4 BC, the exact year remains uncertain. Historians working from the available sources give us a range rather than a fixed date, and the range is what the evidence honestly supports. Corduba was not a small or insignificant place. It was a prosperous Roman city with its own civic culture, its own educated class, its own sense of standing within the provincial world. But it was not Rome, and in a world where Rome was the only address that truly counted, being born anywhere else meant spending your entire career proving something that men born in the capital never had to think about. That particular pressure, the pressure of the outsider who has to be better than the insiders simply to be considered equal, shaped Seneca from the beginning in ways that his philosophy would later try to address and never entirely resolve. His father, known to history as Seneca the Elder, was a man of considerable intellectual seriousness. He was a teacher and student of rhetoric, deeply invested in the art of public argument, at a time when public argument was not a professional skill, but a form of power. Rome, in the early imperial period, still maintained the forms of republican debate. The Senate still met. Cases were still argued in court. A man who could speak with precision and force could move decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. Seneca the Elder understood this and spent his life studying how the best speakers in Roman history had done it. He compiled their speeches, analyzed their methods, preserved their techniques with the care of someone who believed that the quality of public language was a measure of civilizational health. What he passed to his son was not simply a love of words. It was a conviction that language chosen carefully and deployed honestly was among the most durable things a human being could make. Armies dissolve. Empire contracte. Money passes from hand to hand across generations without memory of where it started. But an argument stated with enough clarity and enough truth has a quality of persistence that outlasts the circumstances that produced it. Seneca the Younger absorbed that conviction early. He would spend his life testing it against every circumstance that Rome could produce. And the results of that testing were complicated in ways his father could not have predicted. His mother Helvia appears less often in the historical record, but more often in his own writing. In one of his most personal essays, written during his years of exile on Corsica, he addresses her directly in an attempt to console her for his absence. What comes through is not the formal condolence of a philosopher demonstrating equanimity, but the specific warmth of a son who sees his mother clearly and with genuine admiration. He describes a woman of real intellectual capability who was discouraged from serious study by a husband who, like most Roman men of his generation, believed that too much learning made a woman inconvenient. Seneca describes this with the particular frustration of someone who watched a specific person be smaller than they needed to be. That detail matters more than it might seem. It tells us something about the household he grew up in. Ideas were taken seriously there. The life of the mind was present in daily life. In conversations at the table and books on the shelves, and arguments his father conducted with students about how the best arguments in history had been made, and the gap between what people were capable of and what the world allowed them to become was visible in that house, in the form of his mother's contained intelligence, before Seneca encountered it anywhere else. He had two brothers. Novatus, the eldest, would later become known as Gallio, the Roman official who appears briefly in the New Testament as the proconsul who declined to prosecute the Apostle Paul in Corinth. Mela, the youngest, would become the father of the poet Lucan, who would be swept up in the same political catastrophe that eventually destroyed Seneca. The family produced remarkable minds across 3 generations. That is not coincidence. It is what happens when genuine intelligence meets serious discipline, meets the specific pressure of people who know they have to be better than the competition, simply to be taken seriously. Seneca came to Rome young, brought by his father to receive the education that only Rome could fully provide. He studied rhetoric. As his father had, he studied philosophy, which his father regarded with some suspicion as an impractical distraction from the real work of public life. And he encountered teachers who would shape his thinking for the rest of his career. Among the most significant was Attalus, a Stoic philosopher whose lectures Seneca describes decades later with the warmth of someone recalling an encounter that genuinely changed something. Attalus taught that the philosophical life was not a supplement to ordinary ambition, but a replacement for it, that the person who understood what actually mattered would find, almost automatically, that most of what their society was competing for was not worth the competition. Seneca heard this and found it compelling. He also spent the next 50 years finding it very difficult to live. Stoicism as a philosophical tradition had been founded in Athens around 300 BC by Zeno of Citium, a merchant from Cyprus who, according to ancient accounts, lost his cargo in a shipwreck, arrived in Athens with almost nothing, encountered the writings of Socrates in a bookshop, and concluded that philosophy was more durable than merchandise. Zeno taught in a painted porch, a stoa in Greek, which is where the name of the school came from. His core idea was this: the external world is largely outside your control. What you can control is how you respond to it. Virtue is not what happens to you. Virtue is what you choose to do with what happens to you. By the time Seneca encountered this tradition in Rome, It had passed through several generations of serious thinkers, and had acquired the layered complexity of any living philosophical inheritance. But its core remained recognizable, and, for a young man from Cordoba trying to establish himself in a city that did not owe him anything, it was not an abstract doctrine. It was practical guidance for navigating a world built on connections he did not have and assumptions he did not share. He was talented. He was serious. He was ambitious in the way that people are ambitious, when they have something to prove, and the intelligence to prove it. Romm noticed. He rose through the early stages of a public career, developing a reputation as a writer and thinker whose work combined philosophical depth with genuine literary quality. He began to look like exactly what his father had raised him to be. He was about to discover that Rome had a way of reminding people, at unexpected moments and with very little ceremony, that the city which appeared to be giving you everything was always capable of taking it back. And the first reminder was not going to come from Rome at all. It was going to come from inside his own body. In the dark hours of a Roman night, before he had fully understood what he was building or how much he had to lose. Chapter 2. The Body That Almost Killed Him First. Before Rome could complicate Seneca's life, his own body tried to end it. He was young, probably still in his 20s. When the illness first made itself impossible to ignore, the ancient sources describe it in terms consistent with what we would today recognize as severe chronic respiratory disease. Possibly tuberculosis, possibly something closer to chronic asthma. In the 1st century AD, a serious disease of the lungs was not a manageable condition with a treatment protocol. It was a slow and uncertain companion, present on good days as a background awareness, and present on bad days as something considerably more urgent. Seneca writes about it himself, across many years and many different contexts, with a directness that is one of the most striking qualities of his prose. He does not reach for metaphor before acknowledging the physical fact. He writes about the specific experience of struggling to breathe, the particular quality of fear that belongs to a body that will not perform the one function it absolutely cannot stop performing, with the precision of someone who has lain awake in the dark, waiting to find out whether the difficulty will ease or deepen. In one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, written near the end of his life, he describes an episode from his younger years when the illness became severe enough that he seriously considered ending his life rather than continuing to endure it. What stopped him, he writes, was not philosophical conviction and not Stoic discipline. It was the thought of his father, who was elderly, and whom Seneca did not want to cause that specific grief. He states this plainly. Without decoration, that passage matters. The man who would spend decades writing about how the wise person faces death without fear came very close, when young, to choosing death for reasons that had nothing to do with wisdom, and was drawn back not by philosophy but by ordinary human love. He was not a man who had achieved philosophical peace and was transmitting it from a position of resolved certainty. He was a man genuinely working on the same questions his readers were working on, from inside the difficulty, and who wrote about those questions with the specific authority of someone who has not finished answering them. The illness shaped him in ways that went deeper than biography. Most people live with death as a future event. They know it is coming. They arrange their days without feeling it as present. Seneca felt it as present from very early in his adult life. The Stoic practice of contemplating your own mortality, not as a morbid exercise, but as a way of clarifying what actually matters by imagining its absence, was not for him a discipline he had to cultivate. It was the permanent background condition of his existence, provided by a body that had never been entirely reliable. When he writes in his essay on the shortness of life that we are not given a short life, but that we make it short through waste and inattention, he is not making a philosophical claim from a comfortable distance. He is writing as a man who has genuinely wondered, more than once, how much time remained, and who found that question clarifying in a way that years of comfortable good health never produces. His doctors eventually recommended that he leave Rome. The city's air, thick with smoke from the fires that heated its buildings and cooked its food and powered its workshops, was not helping a man whose lungs were already compromised. He went to Egypt, where his aunt lived and where the climate was considered more favourable for respiratory conditions. He spent several years there, recovering slowly, reading widely, beginning to develop the philosophical voice that would eventually define his reputation. Egypt, in the 1st century AD, was not a retreat from the Roman world. It was one of the wealthiest and most complex provinces in the empire, a place where Greek philosophy, ancient Egyptian religious tradition, Jewish intellectual culture, and Roman administrative authority existed in sometimes productive proximity. What Seneca absorbed there, beyond the cleaner air, was a sense of the world as larger and more various than Rome's confident self-image suggested. He returned to the capital, healthier but not cured. The illness would return across the rest of his life, sometimes severely, always as a reminder that the foundation other people seemed to stand on without thinking about it was, for him, something that required constant attention. He made a choice about how to hold this, not a single dramatic choice made on one specific morning, but a recurring choice, remade across decades, to treat the knowledge of his body's limitations as clarifying rather than paralyzing. The Stoics argued that the quality of a life was determined not by its circumstances, but by the relationship between the person and their circumstances. Seneca had a circumstance that was not going to improve significantly. What he could determine was what that circumstance would mean. He chose to let it mean attention, urgency without panic, the specific seriousness of a person who knows that time is not abstract. That choice was imperfect, as we will see, but the illness was the beginning of the philosophical seriousness that would make him worth reading 2,000 years later, not because suffering is automatically ennobling, which Seneca himself would have rejected as sentimental, but because the specific quality of attention his body forced on him from an early age gave his writing something that purely intellectual conviction cannot produce on its own. He knew what he was talking about. The world ahead would give him considerably more to talk about, and the next lesson was not going to arrive gently. Chapter 3. Caligula, Claudius, and the island that made him. The Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was built on a structural instability that its architects had never fully resolved. It was one of the most powerful political entities the Mediterranean world had ever seen, and its stability depended entirely on the character of one person. When that person was capable, the system worked. When that person was not, the entire apparatus of a sophisticated civilization became an instrument of one individual's worst qualities. Seneca's adult career coincided with a sequence of emperors that tested this problem repeatedly and in different ways. Caligula became emperor in 37 AD, following the death of Tiberius. He was 24 years old. The early months of his reign produced genuine relief across the empire. Tiberius, in his final years, had conducted purges of the senatorial class through treason accusations that required only accusation to destroy a person's life. The young new emperor seemed, by contrast, energetic and accessible. The historian Suetonius records that enormous crowds gathered to welcome him. Within a year, the tone had changed. The ancient source, primarily Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe a deterioration in Caligula's behaviour that historians have been examining carefully for centuries. How much of what those sources report reflects what actually happened, and how much reflects the specific hostility of writers who had political and rhetorical reasons to portray him in the worst possible terms, is a question that cannot be fully resolved with the evidence available. What is not seriously disputed is that his reign became increasingly dangerous for the senatorial class, which was exactly the class to which Seneca belonged. Seneca had by this point established a significant reputation as a writer and orator. The ancient sources suggest that Caligula considered having him executed, reportedly irritated by the quality of his public speaking. Whether that specific account is accurate in all its details, we cannot confirm from the available sources. What the record agrees on is that surviving Caligula's reign required careful navigation that left its mark on anyone who managed it. Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD by members of his own Praetorian Guard. He had been emperor for less than 4 years. His uncle Claudius was declared emperor by the same guard that had just killed his nephew. Discovered, according to Suetonius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, uncertain whether he was about to be killed or crowned. Claudius proved to be a more capable administrator than his undignified accession suggested. He expanded the empire's territory, reformed the bureaucracy, undertook public works of genuine benefit, but his court was shaped by competing influences in ways that made it unpredictable and, for people who found themselves on the wrong side of those influences, genuinely dangerous. Seneca found himself on the wrong side in 41 AD. He was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, a niece of the emperor. Scholars, including Robin Seeger and Anthony Barrett, examining this accusation carefully, have argued that it was politically motivated, most likely engineered by Messalina, Claudius's wife at the time, who had reasons of her own to want Julia Livilla and her associates removed from proximity to imperial power. Julia Livilla was exiled and subsequently died, probably executed. Seneca was sentenced to death, a sentence commuted to exile on the island of Corsica. He was approximately 40 years old. He had spent 2 decades building a career, a reputation, a life in Rome. He packed what he was permitted to take and sailed for an island that the Romans regarded as one of the least desirable locations in the entire empire. He would be there for 8 years. What those years were actually like can be pieced together from what Seneca himself wrote during and after the exile. 2 documents from this period have survived. One was a consolation addressed to his mother Helvia, arguing through sustained philosophical analysis that exile is only a change of location and not a diminishment of the person. The other was a consolation addressed to Polybius, a powerful freedman in Claudius's court. The letter to Polybius is the uncomfortable one, and it deserves honest treatment. It is flattering in ways that go beyond what the formal conventions of the genre required. It praises Claudius with an extravagance that most readers, and Seneca himself in his later writing, found difficult to defend. It is widely understood as an attempt to secure his recall through the intercession of someone with the emperor's ear. It did not work. He remained on Corsica for the full 8 years. This matters, and it is worth sitting with rather than explaining away. A man arguing in one document that a philosopher's identity cannot be diminished by external circumstances was simultaneously writing flattery to a court official in the hope of being allowed to come home. The contradiction was real. The fact that Seneca preserved both documents, that both survived into the manuscript tradition that carries his work to us, suggests that he was not trying to hide it. He was already practicing the specific honesty about his own inconsistency that would become the most distinctive quality of his mature writing. The island was not kind in ordinary ways. He was separated from his father, who died during the exile years without Seneca seeing him again. He was separated from his young son, who also died during this period. He was separated from Rome, from the context in which his entire identity had been built. Think about what that silence must have felt like. The olive groves in the morning light, the sound of the sea at night, indifferent to everything he had been in Rome. Letters arriving slowly, if at all, news from the city coming fragmented and late. A man who had built his entire identity in the most competitive intellectual environment in the world, sitting in a place where none of that history meant anything to the landscape around him. But the exile was also, demonstrably, a period of genuine philosophical deepening, removed from the performances that public life required, from the daily competition of the forum and the social world of the capital. He had no audience to perform for. He had only the questions themselves. What actually matters when everything built in ordinary life is taken away? What remains of a person when the roles and the reputation dissolve? What is the relationship between the philosophy you argue for in comfortable circumstances and the person you discover yourself to be when the circumstances stop being comfortable? These are not questions a successful career in Rome was likely to force upon him. 8 years on an island, grieving, uncertain, writing letters that were not achieving their purpose, forced him to sit with them in a way that left permanent marks on everything he wrote afterward. In 49 AD, the political situation in Rome shifted. Claudius had divorced and executed Messalina. He had married Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable intelligence and equally formidable ambition. Agrippina had a 12-year-old son from her first marriage. She wanted him educated by the best available mind. She arranged for Seneca's recall. He returned to Rome after 8 years away. The island had made him, in the ways that only genuine loss makes a person. What it could not do was prepare him for what was waiting. Nothing could have prepared him for that. Chapter 4. Agrippina's Gamble. The philosopher returns to Rome. There is a version of this story in which Agrippina the Younger was a devoted mother who wanted the finest possible education for her son. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete. Agrippina was, by the careful judgment of most historians who have examined the evidence of her career, one of the most politically sophisticated people in the history of the Roman imperial court, She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, and now the wife of Claudius. She had survived her brother's dangerous reign, survived exile, survived everything the empire had produced in her direction, and she had survived not through passivity, but through precise and patient management of available circumstances. When she brought Seneca back from Corsica and appointed him tutor to her 12-year-old son, she was making a calculation. The calculation did not exclude genuine care for her son's education, but the calculation was the foundation, and understanding it tells us something important about the position Seneca was stepping into. Claudius already had a son of his own. His name was Britannicus, and he was the legitimate heir to the throne by blood and by Roman expectation. Agrippina's central project was to position her own son ahead of Britannicus in the succession. To accomplish this, Nero needed to be visibly and impressively prepared for power. He needed a tutor whose reputation was unimpeachable, whose philosophical credibility was established across the Roman world, and whose personal loyalty, given that Agrippina had just arranged his return from 8 years of exile, could reasonably be expected to be durable. Seneca fit every requirement. He was also a man who understood clearly what was being offered and what was being asked. He had spent 8 years on Corsica as a direct consequence of court politics that Agrippina was now navigating from the position of empress. He understood what it cost to be useful to powerful people and what happened to people who became inconvenient. He accepted the appointment. The primary source for this period is Tacitus. Writing in his annals several decades after the events he describes, Tacitus presents Agrippina consistently in unflattering terms. Scholars including Anthony Barrett, in his careful biographical study of Agrippina, have noted that this portrait reflects the specific anxieties of Roman male writers about female political power as much as it reflects documented historical reality. Tacitus was a serious historian, but reading his account of Agrippina requires holding that context in mind. What the evidence supports, without overclaiming, is this: Agrippina was politically ambitious. She used her influence to advance her son's position. She brought Seneca into that project as a calculated move. She was also a woman operating in a system that gave women no formal political standing whatsoever, which meant that every goal she pursued had to be achieved through relationships and influence and the careful positioning of other people. Whether you call this manipulation or strategy depends on whether you think the person doing it had a legitimate claim to the power she was pursuing. Seneca returned to Rome and resumed his public life quickly. He was appointed to the Senate. He was given the position of praetor, and each morning he sat across from a 12-year-old boy and began the work of teaching him how to think. The curriculum would have included rhetoric, the formal discipline of constructing and delivering arguments, history, the record of Rome's great decisions and the men who made them, philosophy, which in Seneca's hands meant primarily the Stoic tradition, and writing, the practice of finding exact language for imprecise thoughts, developing the discipline that exists in the space between having a feeling and giving it precise form. Nero was not an ordinary 12-year-old, and Seneca would have known this from the beginning. The boy had grown up in the palace, surrounded from earliest childhood by people whose relationship to him was determined almost entirely by what he might one day become. He had a mother whose love for him was genuine, and whose ambition for him was at least as large as her love. He had watched the court from childhood, absorbing its lessons about power and how it worked, learning things about human nature that no 12-year-old in ordinary circumstances would have occasion to learn. The lessons that environment teaches are not the lessons of philosophy. Claudius died in 54 AD. The ancient sources suggest he was poisoned, with Agrippina named most frequently as the likely source, though historians note that the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. What the sources agree on is that Agrippina managed the hours immediately following his death with characteristic precision, keeping news of it contained within the palace, while the arrangements for Nero's accession were finalized. Only when everything was in place did the doors open and the announcement go out. Nero, 16 years old, was presented to the Praetorian Guard by Burrus, the Guard's prefect and Agrippina's political ally. The Guard declared him emperor. The Senate confirmed it. Britannicus was still alive. He was approximately 13 years old. He would be dead within the year. The philosopher from Corsica was now the tutor and advisor to the ruler of the known world. He was standing at the centre of everything he had worked toward since he first arrived in Rome as a young man with something to prove. The question was what he would do with it, and what it would do to him. Chapter 5. The Tutor and the Monster. Here is the question at the centre of this chapter, and it is one Seneca never answered to anyone's full satisfaction, including his own. If you spend years teaching a person that virtue matters, that power without wisdom is a prison, that the ruler who governs through fear is the most enslaved person in the room, and that person becomes capable of terrible things anyway, what does that say about the teaching? What does it say about the teacher? And what does it say about the limits of what philosophy can actually accomplish when it goes up against the accumulated weight of everything else a human being is made of? Nero became emperor at 16. He was not, in those early years, the figure that later history would make of him. Historians, including Edward Champlin, in his careful study of Nero, have argued that the image of a straightforwardly monstrous tyrant from the beginning is a simplification the available evidence does not support. He was charming. He had genuine interests in music and artistic performance. He was capable of warmth and of generosity. In his early years, he made public statements about the kind of emperor he intended to be, statements that Seneca almost certainly helped draft, emphasizing moderation and the principle that legitimate power required the consent of the governed rather than simply the capacity for force. Seneca believed in those statements, or he wanted to believe in them. The distance between those two conditions is something he may not have examined as carefully as his own philosophy required. What Seneca could see clearly was the structure that had produced Nero, a boy raised inside the palace, surrounded from earliest childhood by flattery, given every material thing he desired and denied almost nothing, never required to sit with a consequence, never forced to experience the ordinary friction of a life in which other people's needs sometimes take precedence over your own, a mother who loved him and simultaneously used him, a court full of people whose survival depended on confirming whatever the emperor believed about himself. This is not a structure that produces wisdom. It is a structure that produces a very specific kind of damage. The damage that accumulates in a person who has never genuinely been told no by anyone whose opinion they are required to take seriously. Seneca tried to provide what the rest of Nero's life refused to provide. He argued with him in private. He pushed back on decisions. He wrote, during this period, a work called On Clemency, addressed to Nero by name, making the case that a ruler who shows mercy produces loyalty, while a ruler who relies on fear produces only the appearance of loyalty and the reality of waiting enemies. It is a serious and well-argued document. Reading it now, knowing what followed, it has the quality of a man writing to someone he is already worried about. Britannicus died in 55 AD. Less than a year into Nero's reign, he was approximately 13 years old. He died at a dinner table in the palace. Convulsing suddenly in the presence of the assembled court, Nero told those present it was an epileptic episode. The dinner continued. Tacitus does not accept this account. He describes the death as deliberate poisoning, organized by Nero, carried out through a woman named Locusta, who was known in the court for such work and who would be used again in subsequent years. Modern historians treat Tacitus's account as plausible but not provable. The political logic is clear enough. Britannicus alive was always a potential focus for opposition to Nero. His removal, so early in the reign, has the character of a preemptive action taken by someone who had absorbed certain lessons about how power is maintained, even if not the lessons Seneca had been trying to teach. There are 4 distinct positions a person in Seneca's situation could occupy in relation to what was happening, and distinguishing between them carefully is more honest than collapsing them into a single verdict. The first is active participation, planning or facilitating the violence directly. The second is knowledge and deliberate silence. The third is managed incuriosity, an arrangement not to be told things that would require a response one is not prepared to make. The fourth is genuine powerlessness, knowing, objecting through available channels, and being disregarded. For the death of Britannicus, no ancient source places Seneca in the first category. For the remaining 3, the evidence does not permit a confident verdict, and claiming confidence where the sources do not support it would fail exactly the kind of honesty this story is trying to maintain. What can be said is that his continued presence in the court after Britannicus died was a choice. Resignation and retirement were possible. They carried risk, but they were not inconceivable. He chose to stay. The killing of Agrippina in 59 AD brought Seneca's direct involvement into the documented record more clearly. Nero's first attempt to kill his mother failed. The plan, described by Tacitus, involved a collapsible boat designed to sink with Agrippina aboard. She survived by swimming to shore and sent a messenger to her son, informing him she had survived what she called a terrible accident. Nero, understanding that she understood what had happened, sent soldiers to her villa that same night. She was killed there. Tacitus writes that, in the immediate aftermath, Nero was in a state of considerable agitation, uncertain how to present what had happened to the Senate. He sent for Seneca and Burrus. According to Tacitus, Burrus indicated that the Praetorian Guard could not endorse the killing. Seneca then composed the letter. The letter, sent to the Senate, presented Agrippina's death as the result of a discovered conspiracy against the emperor's life. It was a document designed to make official something that could not survive honest public examination, and Tacitus is explicit that Seneca wrote it. Tacitus was not a neutral observer, and his account reflects rhetorical purposes that go beyond simple reportage. The specificity of the scene has struck many historians as having some basis in actual events, even when the precise texture has been shaped in the telling. If the account is broadly accurate, Seneca used his skills and his credibility to give official form to something that required those things to be made to appear legitimate. He did not plan the killing. He did not execute it. But he was not in the fourth category either. He continued writing, in this period and the years that followed, with increasing urgency about exactly the moral questions his own situation raised, about the corruption that proximity to power produces slowly and almost invisibly, about the way each small compromise creates the conditions for the next one. He was writing about himself, and the fact that he could not stop asking hard questions about his own choices, even when the answers were unflattering, was itself a form of moral seriousness that deserves acknowledgement alongside everything else. He could not stop asking the question. He could not find a clean answer. He kept asking anyway. Chapter 6. The 5 Good Years. There is a phrase preserved in the ancient sources, a remark attributed to the Emperor Trajan and recorded by the later writer Aurelius Victor, describing the first 5 years of Nero's reign as among the finest periods of Roman governance since Augustus. The Latin term historians use is quinquennium Neronis. The 5 years of Nero, it requires an effort of imagination to hold that alongside everything else we know about Nero's career. But the effort is worth making, because what those 5 years actually were, and how they came to be, tells us more about Seneca's real contribution to Roman public life than any of the more dramatic episodes in his biography. When Nero became emperor in 54 AD, the empire was not in crisis. Its borders were largely stable. Its finances were in reasonable order. Its administrative machinery was capable of functioning effectively, if not actively disrupted. What the transition required was not dramatic reform, but competent stewardship. A steady presence at the centre of a system that was already running. A 16-year-old boy raised in the palace could not provide that on his own. He needed people who could. The people he had were Seneca and Burrus. Sextus Afranius Burrus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, practical and direct, with the particular loyalty of a man whose own position was inseparable from the stability of the emperor he served. He and Seneca formed, in the early years of Nero's reign, a governing partnership in the informal sense that the Principate permitted 2 men of different training and different instincts who shared a common interest in keeping the young emperor functional and the empire running. Seneca handled the language. The speech Nero delivered to the Senate immediately after assuming power, promising moderation and respect for senatorial authority and a deliberate distance from the abuses of previous reigns, was composed by Seneca. The ancient sources say as much, and the quality of the rhetoric is consistent with everything we know about his writing at its best. Senators who had lived through Caligula and the complicated court of Claudius heard it and found it, for the moment, credible. Those words were not empty in the early years. The reign reduced certain taxes that had been particularly burdensome. It limited the use of informers. The system of paid accusation that had made private life dangerous under previous emperors. It gave the Senate more genuine involvement in provincial administration. It conducted itself with a restraint that made the preceding decades seem, in retrospect, like a different and darker era. This was Seneca's contribution, not in the sense that he was secretly governing in Nero's place, which the evidence does not support, but in the sense that the philosophical framework he had spent decades developing was being applied, however imperfectly, to one of the largest political systems of its time. For those first years, the test produced encouraging results. But it is important to be precise about what the 5 good years actually were. They were good in the sense of competent and relatively humane governance. They were not good in the sense of a court whose moral character had been reformed. Britannicus had died in the very first year of the reign, in the dining room of the palace. While the court looked away, the violence at the centre of imperial power had not been eliminated by Seneca's influence. It had been contained, kept from expanding into the more systematic brutality that would come later. That is a real achievement. It is also a limited one. Seneca knew this. He was too careful a thinker not to know it. Burrus died in 62 AD. The ancient sources disagree about whether his death was natural or assisted, and the question cannot be resolved from the available evidence. With him went the partnership that had given Seneca his most reliable ally. Nero replaced him with Tigellinus, a man whose primary skill was confirming the emperor's existing preferences and whose primary loyalty was to his own continued usefulness. The balance that had held for 8 years began to shift. The 5 good years were not proof that philosophy could transform power. They were evidence that philosophy, near power, could moderate its worst expressions for a time, under favourable conditions, with the right partner, and with an emperor who was still young enough and uncertain enough to listen. When those conditions changed, everything built on them changed too, and Seneca, standing in the court watching the change happen, understood that the years ahead would ask something of him that the 5 good years had given him no practice in providing. Chapter 7. The Wealth Problem. Let us be direct about this from the beginning, because Seneca was direct about it, and the least we can do is match his honesty. He was, at the peak of his influence, one of the wealthiest men in Rome. The ancient source, primarily Cassius Dio, describe a fortune of extraordinary scale. Historians debate the precise figures, which come from sources that were not always neutral and may reflect exaggeration for rhetorical purposes. The specific numbers should be treated with caution. What is not in serious dispute is that Seneca accumulated substantial wealth during the years of his proximity to imperial power, that he owned multiple properties across Italy, and that the scale of his material life stood in obvious and significant tension with the philosophy he was simultaneously producing. He knew this. He wrote about it himself, directly, during the period of his greatest prosperity. In his essay on the Happy Life, he addresses the accusation of hypocrisy that was already being made against him by critics during his own lifetime. He does not deny the wealth. He does not pretend the tension does not exist. He argues instead that the Stoic position on wealth is not that wealth is evil, but that attachment to wealth is the danger. A philosopher can be wealthy, he writes, provided the wealth is held loosely enough that losing it would not change who the person fundamentally is. It is a coherent argument. It is also genuinely convenient for a wealthy man to make. Seneca was honest enough to see both of those things simultaneously. That is part of what makes his writing on this subject more interesting than a simpler treatment would be. The deeper tension is not simply that he was rich while writing about simplicity. That kind of gap is ordinary and human, and does not by itself disqualify a person from serious attention. The deeper tension is that his wealth was not incidental to his position, but a product of it. It accumulated during the years when he was one of the most influential, unofficial figures in the Roman Empire, when his access to the emperor was unmatched, and when that access created financial opportunities that would not have been available to anyone who had not arranged their life in the specific way Seneca had arranged his. Roman wealth in the 1st century AD did not accumulate through the patient saving of a careful professional. It accumulated through land, through lending, through the financial relationships that depended on knowing the right people at the right moments. Seneca knew all of the right people. He was, for nearly a decade, as close to the centre of Roman power as it was possible to be without holding formal imperial office. His critics, then and now, have argued that the wealth was proof of fraudulence, that a man who genuinely believed what he wrote would not have lived as Seneca lived. His defenders have argued that the philosophy should be judged on its own terms, and that a thinker's personal failures do not invalidate their arguments. Both positions capture something and miss something. What they miss is the third possibility, that Seneca was neither a pure hypocrite performing wisdom he did not hold, nor a genuine sage inconveniently surrounded by villas, but something more difficult than either, a man who genuinely believed what he wrote and genuinely failed to live up to it, who was fully aware of the gap, who documented it with a precision that his critics' simpler narratives cannot match, and who never resolved it. In his letters to Lucilius, written when the wealth had become a problem he was trying to give back and was not permitted to give back, he returns to this territory with the specific intensity of someone who has been in the middle of something for a long time and is finally able to see its full shape. He writes about the way comfort accumulates its own logic, the way each small accommodation feels reasonable in the moment and adds up to something you did not intend when you examine the total from a distance. There is also a dimension to the wealth that deserves to be stated plainly. In the world of Nero's Rome, being wealthy enough to be worth keeping alive was not a trivial consideration for a man in Seneca's position. The emperor who could decide on a given morning to have someone killed and confiscate their estate had less reason to make that decision about a person whose financial relationships extended across the empire and whose social connections were wide and deep. The wealth was philosophically inconvenient and practically protective. Both things were simultaneously true, and a man of Seneca's intelligence would have been aware of both when he offered, in 62 AD, to return everything to Nero, to give back the properties and the money, and to retire to a simple life of study. The offer was an acknowledgement that the wealth had become a burden he no longer wanted to carry. Nero refused. That conversation belongs to the next chapter. The critics who use Seneca's wealth to dismiss his philosophy entirely are making an error. The arguments do not depend on the philosopher's consistency for their validity. The observation that what you cannot control is not worth your anxiety, that virtue is the only genuine good, that time spent performing status is time taken from the actual work of living. None of that becomes false, because the man who wrote it owned more land than he needed. But the critics who ignore the wealth entirely, who treat it as irrelevant, are making an equal and opposite error. What Seneca's wealth problem actually shows us is what philosophy looks like when it is practiced honestly rather than performed convincingly. Not the serene possession of answers, not the comfortable altitude of a man who has solved his own contradictions, but the ongoing, sometimes failing, always examined effort to close the gap between what you know and how you live. He kept measuring the gap. He closed it imperfectly. He documented the failure with enough precision that 2,000 years later the documentation still teaches something the success stories cannot. That is not a small thing to leave behind, and what he was about to face in the years ahead would test every word of it. Chapter 8. The man in the middle of it. There is a particular kind of moral position that is harder to describe than either heroism or villainy, and that is more common than either. It is the position of a person who is neither the author of the worst things happening around them, nor genuinely innocent of those things. A person who knows, who stays, who continues to do work that lends credibility to a situation that could not bear honest examination, and who cannot fully explain, even to themselves, where exactly the line was crossed between being present and being complicit. That is the position Seneca occupied in the court of Nero across the late 50s and early 60s AD. Understanding it requires resisting the pull toward a verdict that is cleaner than the evidence supports. The available ancient sources, primarily Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, were all writing decades after the events they describe. None of them were neutral. All of them had rhetorical purposes that shaped what they chose to record and how they chose to record it. Where those sources agree, we will say so. Where they disagree, or where the evidence is insufficient for a confident conclusion, we will say that too. What can be said with confidence is this. By the time Barrett died in 62 AD, the court Seneca inhabited had produced the death of Britannicus, the exile and eventual execution of Nero's first wife Octavia, which came in 62 AD after Nero divorced her to marry Poppaea, and the killing of Agrippina in 59 AD. These events were separated by years and by different circumstances, and should not be collapsed into a single narrative of continuous atrocity. But the direction of travel across those years was consistent, and Seneca was present throughout. The specific question worth asking about Seneca's position is not whether he was good or bad. It is a more precise question. What function did his presence serve in that court? And was he aware of that function? One of the clearest things Seneca's continued presence provided was legitimacy. His name, his reputation, his continued public association with the reign, communicated to the Roman world that the emperor was still connected to the philosophical principles that the early years had promised. Every essay he published, every speech he drafted, every public association between his reputation and Nero's functioned as a form of endorsement. It told the Roman world that a man of genuine philosophical seriousness was still close to the throne and still working. This is worth stating carefully, because it is an editorial observation about the structural function of his presence rather than something the ancient sources state directly. But it describes something real about how proximity to power works. And Seneca himself, in his writing from this and subsequent periods, circles this precise territory with an intensity that suggests he understood it and could not stop thinking about it. He writes, in essays from this period, about the way that proximity to power corrupts not through dramatic moments of choice, but through the slow accumulation of small adjustments. Each one feels reasonable. Each one can be justified by the argument that remaining and moderating is better than leaving and abandoning the field to people with no principles at all, and each one makes the next one slightly easier. because the person you were before the first adjustment is slightly further away. He was writing about himself, not abstractly, not from a safe distance. From inside a situation he could not fully leave and could not fully justify, with the specific urgency of a man who knows that the examination he is conducting on the page is the only honest accounting he has left available to him. He could not undo what had been done. He could not retrieve the letter he had written for Nero after Agrippina's death. He could not reach back across the years and make different choices at the moments when dim prices might have made a difference. What he could do was keep writing, keep asking, keep refusing to construct a version of himself that was more comfortable than the evidence supported. The gap between the philosopher Seneca presented himself as being and the man the court had required him to become was real. He knew it was real, and the fact that he could not stop measuring it, could not find a framing that fully resolved it, could not write his way to a clean conscience, is itself a form of integrity that deserves acknowledgement alongside the acknowledgement of everything else. It is not the integrity of a person who kept their hands clean. It is the integrity of a person who kept looking at their hands honestly. That is a different and more difficult thing. And in a court where most people had stopped looking entirely, it was not nothing. Chapter 9. The Retirement That Came Too Late. By 62 AD, Seneca had been at the centre of Roman imperial power for 13 years. He was somewhere in his mid-60s. He was wealthy beyond any practical need. He was celebrated across the Roman world as one of the most significant philosophical voices of his generation. And he was, by every indication available from his writing and from the historical record of the period, tired in a way that went considerably deeper than physical fatigue. Picture the life he was living in those years. He rose before dawn, as he writes about in several of the letters, in the specific quiet of a Roman morning before the city fully woke, the oil lamp on the table, the wax tablet or the papyrus, the hours of writing that had become the only part of his day that felt entirely his own. Then the demands of the court, the visits, the correspondence, the careful navigation of a social world that had become more dangerous with every passing season. Burrus was gone. Tigellinus had replaced him as Nero's primary confidant, a man whose skill was not governance but flattery, whose primary loyalty was to his own continued usefulness. The conversations Seneca could have safely, the things that could be said without calculation, had contracted to almost nothing. He asked to leave. The conversation is recorded by Tacitus with the specific detail that suggests something real underneath the literary shaping. Seneca requested a private audience. He came not with a demand or a complaint, but with what he framed as a personal request rooted in his own limitations. He was aging. His health was declining. He was no longer equal to the demands his position made on him. He offered to return his wealth to the emperor, to give back the properties and the money, and to retire to a quiet life of philosophical study without public role or public visibility. It was, in its surface form, the most stoic thing he had done in years. The voluntary renunciation of wealth, the withdrawal from public life, the turn toward the contemplative existence he had been describing in his writing for decades, the program, finally being offered as a lived reality rather than a philosophical argument. Nero refused. His response, as Tacitus records it, was gracious in language and firm in substance. He told Seneca that his own reputation depended on the continued association with his tutor. He said that people would think worse of him if Seneca withdrew, that the perception of abandonment would damage the emperor publicly. He cited Seneca's age and health as reasons why Seneca needed imperial protection rather than as reasons why Seneca deserved to be released. He told him to keep the wealth. He told him to remain. Tacitus presents this with the understated irony that is one of his most characteristic techniques. The emperor's stated reasons for why Seneca should stay are also, read carefully, a statement of why Seneca could not leave. The gracious language does not fully conceal the fact that withdrawal was not, in practical terms, a real option. Seneca understood this. He had understood it, at some level, for years. The position he occupied was not the kind of position from which a man could simply resign and walk away. He was not an employee who could give notice and spend his remaining years reading in the afternoon light of a country villa. He was a man whose value to the emperor was inseparable from his proximity to the emperor, and whose proximity to the emperor made him, simultaneously, a potential source of risk. The same closeness that made him useful made him visible, and visible men in Nero's Rome did not get to become invisible again without that becoming its own kind of statement. He attempted a partial withdrawal. He stopped attending the court with regularity. He spent more time at his various properties outside the city, in the quiet of the countryside, where the mornings were his own and the political noise of Rome was far enough away to be temporarily ignorable. In those rooms, by those lamps, he wrote with an urgency his earlier work does not quite have. The essays from these final years carry the specific pressure of a man writing against a closing window. On Leisure argued that the turn toward philosophical study could be a genuine contribution to humanity rather than a retreat from it. On the Shortness of Life contained some of the most direct sentences he ever produced about the way human beings consume the hours they have been given. He was not writing for an abstract reader. He was writing to himself, in a form that could be shared, about a situation he could not describe directly. Outside those quiet rooms, Rome was becoming more dangerous by the month. Treason accusations were increasing. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had lived through Caligula's reign. Seneca had lived through it. He knew what the acceleration of such accusations meant for where things were heading. The fire of 64 AD consumed large sections of the city. Nero used the cleared land to begin construction of his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an undertaking of enormous scale at a moment when the treasury was strained and the city's population was still displaced. Many historians have examined the question of who was responsible for the fire and whether Nero's subsequent response was politically motivated. The Christians of Rome were blamed and persecuted. A scapegoating operation that a number of historians, including Miriam Griffin, have examined critically. Though scholars continue to debate the extent and nature of Nero's direct role in organizing the persecutions, the senatorial class was frightened. The mood in the city was the specific mood of a population that has been through too much and no longer trusts the center of its own power. Seneca kept writing. The letters to Lucilius were going out to Sicily, one after another, with the specific intimacy of a man who has decided that whatever time remains will be used for the thing he has always argued matters most. He did not know how little time remained, but some part of him, the part that had been paying attention for 65 years and had learned to read the signs of what was coming, already knew. The conspiracy that would end his life was forming in the city he could no longer safely navigate, and this time There would be no island to exile him to. Chapter 10. The Pisonian Conspiracy. Rome, 65 AD. The Great Fire was a year behind the city. The Domus Aurea was rising on cleared land near the centre of Rome. Nero had been emperor for 11 years. The senatorial class was frightened in the specific way that people become frightened when they have watched enough of their colleagues destroyed to understand that no position is safe and no loyalty is sufficient protection. Into this atmosphere, a conspiracy formed around a man named Gaius Calpurnius Piso. He was a senator of distinguished family. Handsome and popular in the way that men become symbols of possible alternatives when the present alternative has become intolerable, he was not, by most assessments, a man of exceptional political depth or moral seriousness. He was a name that people who wanted Nero gone could organize around. The conspiracy was large. It included senators, equestrians, military officers, and members of the Praetorian Guard itself. Large conspiracies in the Roman imperial system had a structural vulnerability that smaller ones did not share. The more people who knew about a plan to kill an emperor, the more people there were who might calculate that informing the emperor was more personally advantageous than following through. That calculation was made. A woman named Epicharis had been involved in the conspiracy and had attempted to recruit a naval officer to the cause. He reported her instead. She was arrested and tortured. She revealed nothing. When the torturers returned the following day to continue, she had used a strap from her own clothing to hang herself rather than risk breaking under further pressure and giving up names she had protected through everything they had already done to her. She was, Tacitus notes, a woman with no prior connection to the conspirators, who had held under torture what men of senatorial rank and philosophical education would fail to hold when their own turn came. Her arrest put the conspirators on notice that their window was closing. The urgency that followed produced the kind of careless communication that brought the whole structure down. In April of 65 AD, Nero was informed. The arrests began immediately. Interrogations produced names. Names produced more arrests. Within days, the conspiracy had collapsed, and the executions had begun. Piso killed himself before he could be taken. Others were executed. Others were exiled. The reprisals spread outward from the original conspiracy into a wider purge that reached anyone Nero regarded as a potential threat, which, in the paranoid atmosphere of 65 AD, included a substantial portion of the senatorial class. Where was Seneca? This is the question the historical sources raise without cleanly answering, and it deserves the careful treatment that honest history requires, rather than the confident verdict that dramatic storytelling prefers. Tacitus is the primary source. He describes a man named Natalis who, under interrogation, claimed to have visited Seneca on behalf of Piso and to have carried messages between them. Seneca, according to Natalis, had responded to these communications in ways that Natalis characterized as sympathetic to the conspiracy's purposes. Nero sent officers to question Seneca directly. Seneca was at his country estate outside Rome at the time. He told the officers that he had received a visit from Natalis, but that their conversation had concerned his own health. Specifically, his reasons for not seeing Piso. He denied any knowledge of a conspiracy. He denied any commitment to Piso's cause. Tacitus presents the denial, notes that Nero did not have clear evidence of direct participation, and describes the decision to order Seneca's death regardless. Modern historians who have examined this question with appropriate care, including Miriam Griffin in her scholarly biography of Seneca, generally conclude that the evidence for direct participation in the Pisonian conspiracy is insufficient to support a confident verdict in either direction. Griffin notes that Seneca may have been aware that opposition to Nero was forming in some general sense without being an active participant in the specific plan that Piso was leading. The distinction between knowing and participating, clear in principle, was extremely difficult to maintain in the social environment of 65 AD Rome, where information moved through personal networks and a conversation could implicate a person in things they had not formally agreed to. What the evidence honestly supports is this. Seneca was not proven to have been an active member of the Pisonian conspiracy by any standard that serious historical judgment would accept. The ancient sources do not provide that proof. Historians who have examined those sources carefully do not claim it exists. What is also true is that Seneca had every reason to want the situation to change. He had watched Nero's deterioration across 11 years. He had tried and failed to moderate it. He had tried and failed to leave it. The psychological and moral weight of that position was not small, and a man of his intelligence would not have been unaware of conversations happening around him about what might be done. Whether that awareness led him to actively support a conspiracy, or only to a posture of sympathy and private hope that someone else would resolve what he could not, is a question the evidence does not resolve. Nero chose not to make the distinction. The order was sent. A tribune of the Praetorian Guard arrived at Seneca's estate with the message, there was no formal trial. There was no charge that required a defence. There was the message, delivered by a soldier, that the emperor required Seneca to die. The manner was left to Seneca's choosing. He had been thinking about this moment for 40 years. Now the thinking was over, and only the living of it remained. Chapter 11. How to Die. The final hours. Imagine the villa in the late afternoon, the same kind of light that had been falling over Rome all day, gold and unhurried, the kind of light that has no interest in what is happening beneath it. The garden outside the window, the sound of the estate continuing its ordinary routines, because most of the people in it did not yet know what the soldier had just delivered. Inside, a 69-year-old man was making the last decisions of his life, and he was making them with a composure that either reflects the full depth of everything he had written and believed, or reflects the specific quality of a mind that had been preparing for this moment long enough that the preparation had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. The account of Seneca's death comes primarily from Tacitus, and it is one of the most carefully composed death scenes in ancient literature. Tacitus was a great writer as well as a serious historian, and the scene he constructs has the shape of something built with deliberate attention to detail and thematic resolution. It reflects both what may have happened and how Tacitus understood what it meant. Holding both of those things simultaneously is the honest way to read it. Seneca received the message with what Tacitus describes as composure. He asked whether there was any possibility of writing a will. There was not. He turned to his friends, who were weeping, and told them that he was leaving them what was most valuable, the example of his life. Paulina, his wife, said she would die with him. He asked her not to. She refused his asking. With the quiet of a woman who had made her decision before the conversation began, he accepted her decision. And Tacitus notes, with the kind of small, specific detail that tends to carry the texture of something real. That Seneca also told her, honestly, that he was glad not to face what was coming entirely alone. They opened their veins together. What followed was slow. Seneca was old, his body weakened by decades of illness and by the deliberate austerity of his final years. The blood moved too slowly to produce the rapid unconsciousness the method was supposed to bring. He continued to speak. His secretaries continued to write. What exactly he said in those hours is not preserved in full. Tacitus gives us the scene rather than the transcript. And the scene is what has travelled forward through time. He asked for hemlock, the poison that had killed Socrates 5 centuries earlier in a prison in Athens. He wanted to accelerate a process his body was refusing to accelerate. The hemlock was brought. It had no effect skim. His circulation was too sluggish, his body too cold, to carry it where it needed to go. He was moved to a warm bath, the steam rising from the water, the voices of his friends growing quieter in the room, the light outside the window moving as late afternoon moved toward evening, the steam doing what the blood loss and the hemlock had not managed. Finishing it slowly and without drama, he was gone. Paulina survived. Nero, in a decision that appears to reflect concern about how 2 deaths would appear rather than any change in his intentions, sent soldiers to bind her wounds before she had lost too much blood. She lived for several years after her husband's death. Tacitus notes that she remained permanently pale, a pallor that stayed in her face for the rest of her life as the visible record of what she had been willing to do. The scene Tacitus constructs is unmistakably designed to recall the death of Socrates as Plato described it in the Phaedo. The calm philosopher, the weeping friends, the continuing conversation, the slow physical process, the final words, the parallel is too precise to be accidental. Tacitus knew what he was doing, and Seneca, who had read the Phaedo many times, who had spent his career thinking about how a philosopher should face death, was almost certainly aware of the parallel himself as it was unfolding. This is the question the death scene raises, and it is worth holding carefully. Was this genuine Stoic courage? A man who had written about facing death without fear, finally demonstrating that the writing was not performance? Or was it a final performance? A man always conscious of his audience, making sure that consciousness held together at the moment when it would matter most. The honest answer is that those 2 things are not as separate as they might appear. Courage is not the absence of fear. Seneca wrote this himself, more clearly than almost anyone before or since. Courage is the choice to act rightly in the presence of fear, to do what you believe is right, even when the alternative is available. Seneca had an alternative. He could have begged. He could have offered information about the conspiracy, real or invented, in exchange for his life. He could have wept and thrown himself on the mercy of an emperor who had already decided. He did none of those things. Whether his hands were steady when the tribune arrived, whether the composure Tacitus describes reflected his actual interior state or only his outward presentation, we cannot know. What we can say is that the choice to face the moment the way he did, with his secretaries present and words still being formed, was consistent with everything he had argued across a lifetime. That how you die is not separate from how you lived, but continuous with it. The comparison with Socrates holds and also shows its limits. Socrates died for a principle in the most direct sense. He refused to stop asking questions, refused the city's demand that he become someone other than who he was, and paid for that refusal with his life. His death and his philosophy were the same thing. Seneca's death was more complicated. He was not dying because he had refused to compromise his principles. He had compromised them across many years, and was dying anyway, not because of the compromises, but despite them, because an emperor whose paranoia had reached the point where evidence was no longer required had decided he was a risk worth eliminating. What Seneca chose was not the cause of his death, but the manner of meeting it. In the warm bath, with the steam rising and the voices fading, and the afternoon light going softer through the window, he was completing something he had started in Cordoba as a young man who had already come close to not surviving, continued on Corsica as an exile, learning what loss actually felt like, tested in 13 years, in the court of a man whose direction of travel had been clear for a long time. The sentence was not perfect. His life had not been perfect. The distance between what he wrote and how he lived was real and remained real to the end. But the final paragraph was honest. And in a life that had been many things, the honesty of that ending was not a small thing. It may have been the most stoic thing he ever did. Chapter 12. The letters he left behind. There is a particular kind of writing that can only come from someone who has already lost most of what they were afraid of losing. Not the writing of a person who has achieved peace. Not wisdom transmitted from a comfortable altitude above the difficulty, but the writing of a person who has been through the fire of their own compromises, who has watched the distance between their ideals and their choices widen across decades, and who has decided, in whatever time remains, to be as honest as they can manage. That is what the letters to Lucilius are. Seneca addressed them to Gaius Lucilius Jr., a younger friend who was serving as a provincial governor in Sicily. 124 letters survive. Though scholars believe the original collection may have been larger, whether all of them were actually sent to the historical Lucilius, or whether some were composed as philosophical essays in epistolary form, is a question the evidence does not resolve definitively. What is not in question is that they represent the fullest and most personal expression of Seneca's philosophical voice that has come down to us from antiquity. Picture him writing them. The morning still dark outside the window of whatever property he was using as his retreat from Rome, the lamp burning low on the table, the stylus moving across the wax tablet, or the pen across the papyrus, in the specific quiet of a man who has arranged his mornings to protect the hours before the world arrives. No court, no performance, no calculation about what could safely be said to whom, just the questions, and the page, and the particular honesty that becomes available when there is almost nothing left to protect. The letters are not systematic. They do not build a logical argument from first principles toward a grand conclusion. They move between topics, circle back on themselves, question positions taken in earlier letters, develop ideas only to examine them from a different angle in the next. They have the texture of a mind in genuine motion rather than a mind presenting conclusions it has already reached. That quality is precisely what has kept them alive. The first letter opens with a sentence that has travelled across 2,000 years with the persistence of something that touched something real the first time it was read. Seneca tells Lucilius to claim ownership of himself, to gather and protect the time that until now has been taken, stolen, or simply lost. He writes that nothing belongs to us except time. Everything else is subject to fortune. Time alone, once gone, cannot be recovered. He is not making a new philosophical point. The Stoics had been making this observation since Zeno. What is new is the urgency. This is not a letter written from a position of achieved wisdom. It is a letter from a man in his 60s who has spent 30 years in proximity to power and wealth and influence, who has watched those things consume the hours and years he cannot get back, and who is writing to a younger friend with the specific intensity of someone who wants that friend to understand something before the years, make the understanding come too late. He writes about death in almost every letter, not obsessively and not morbidly. He writes about it the way a person writes about something they have thought about so long and so honestly that it has lost most of its capacity to frighten and has become instead a clarifying lens. He writes that we should contemplate our own mortality daily, not as a practice in despair, but as a way of understanding what actually matters by imagining its absence. He writes that the person who has genuinely learned to die has unlearned slavery. He writes about friendship with a warmth that surprises readers who come to the letters expecting cold philosophical argument. He tells Lucilius that a person who has not yet made a friend has not yet truly begun to live. He writes about the specific quality of a relationship in which you can say anything without calculation, in which you do not have to manage your presentation or protect your position, in which the other person knows your weaknesses and is present with you anyway. Reading those passages, knowing what his years in Nero's court had actually been like, knowing how few of the relationships available to him in that environment could have carried that quality of honesty, the warmth of what he writes about genuine friendship has a specific weight it would not have in a life that had been full of such relationships throughout. He writes about time with an intensity that never diminishes across the full arc of the letters. How we allow the urgent to displace the important, how we defer what matters in favour of what presses, how we arrive at the end of a day, a month, a year, a life, and find that we cannot fully account for where it went. He knew this failure from the inside. He had spent years in a court that consumed time the way fire consumes material, continuously and without producing anything proportionate to what it took. He had spent years accumulating things, his own accounting identified as inferior substitutes for what he actually wanted, which was the time and the quiet and the honest attention to think clearly about what mattered and to write it down. He was doing that now. By those morning lamps, in those quiet rooms outside Rome, he was finally doing the thing he had always argued was the most important thing. He was examining his life, publicly, in letters addressed to a friend, but written with the awareness that they would travel further than one reader. Honestly, with the specific honesty of a man who has little left to protect. Persistently, returning to the same questions from different directions, not because he had found the answers, but because the questions themselves were worth the lifetime he had given them. He writes in one of the later letters that it is not that we have too little time, it is that we waste too much of it. That life is long enough if you know how to use it. That the person who grasps each hour as it arrives has time enough for everything that actually matters. He writes this as a man who did not always grasp the hours as they arrived, who allowed significant portions of his life to be consumed by arrangements, his own philosophy identified as secondary. The argument comes from inside the failure, not from above it. That is not a reason to distrust it. That is the reason it still carries weight. Montaigne encountered the letters in the 16th century and absorbed them so completely that the absorption is visible in everything he wrote afterward. What Montaigne found in Seneca was not doctrine, but permission. The permission to examine yourself in public without arriving at false resolution, to hold your own contradictions in view rather than resolving them into comfortable positions, to speak honestly about the actual difficulty of living rather than the theoretical program for doing so well. That permission, and the form Montaigne developed to act on it, became the essay, and the essay became one of the primary forms through which honest thinking about human experience has travelled through the centuries since. The letters survived. They have been read continuously since antiquity. They reached generations of readers across 20 centuries who found in them not a saint but a companion, someone who had been in the middle of the same difficulty and who was still thinking about it, honestly, from inside rather than above. That is what you have when you have the letters. Not a solution, a companion, someone still working on the problem, 2,000 years away, in the same dark. Chapter 13. The Hypocrite Who Changed the World. Let us come back to where we began. A villa outside Rome, late afternoon light, a man in a warm bath, still talking, because there are still things worth saying. He had written all of it, believed most of it, lived up to some of it, and failed at parts of it in ways he documented with more honesty than most people apply to their successes. Was he a philosopher or a hypocrite? After everything we have examined, after Corduba and Rome and Corsica and the court and the wealth and the letters and the bath, the honest answer is that the question itself contains an assumption worth examining before we try to answer it. The assumption is that philosopher and hypocrite are mutually exclusive, that a person who fails to live up to their own principles has therefore forfeited the right to hold them, that the distance between the ideal and the actual is evidence of fraud rather than evidence of a human being doing what human beings consistently do, which is to understand considerably more than they can consistently practice. Seneca was both. He was a philosophical writer of genuine originality and lasting power. He was also a man who accumulated great wealth while writing about simplicity, who remained in the court of a murderous emperor while writing about the obligations of moral courage, who used his skills to give official form to at least one act that could not survive honest examination. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. What makes him worth reading across 2,000 years is not that he was consistent. It is that he was honest about his inconsistency, and that the honesty produced writing that knows what it is talking about from inside the experience, rather than from the comfortable distance of a life that has not been seriously tested. His influence on the tradition that followed him is structural, not marginal. Montaigne built the essay form on the foundation of what he found in Seneca. The willingness to examine yourself in public without arriving at tidy resolution, to hold contradictions in view rather than resolving them into comfortable positions, to speak honestly about the actual difficulty of living. That impulse, which Montaigne found in the letters and developed into a form, has travelled through every writer since, who has tried to think honestly in public about what it means to be a person. Erasmus edited Seneca's works for a Renaissance readership and found in them an argument for the compatibility of classical philosophy and Christian ethics that helped shape the intellectual culture of the Reformation. The Stoic insistence on conscience, on the primacy of inner moral judgment over the external performance of virtue, resonated with a moment in history when the authority of external religious institutions was being questioned with unprecedented force. The overlap between Stoic moral seriousness and early Christian ethical concern was real enough that a later tradition produced a set of letters purportedly exchanged between Seneca and the Apostle Paul. Modern scholars are virtually unanimous that these letters are forgeries, probably composed in the 4th century to establish a connection that felt theologically useful. What is genuine is the overlap that made the forgery seem plausible. Seneca, more than almost any other pagan philosopher, remained readable and usable across the boundary between the ancient world and the world that followed it. His ideas travelled forward, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, and into the contemporary moment, contributing indirectly and through many layers of transmission to how later thinkers understood the relationship between individual conscience and political authority. The connections are real, and they are also long and complex, and stating them simply would do a disservice to the actual history of how ideas travel. The contemporary interest in Stoic philosophy reflects a cultural moment in which many people find that the tools their society has provided for managing anxiety and uncertainty are insufficient. The ancient questions remain: how do you stay grounded when the external world is chaotic? How do you know what actually matters when everything insists on equal urgency? How do you face your own mortality without being paralyzed by it? How do you live honestly in a system that rewards appearance over substance? These are not new questions. They are the questions Seneca was asking in a provincial city in Hispania, in a Roman court, on an island in the Mediterranean, and in the letters he sent to his friend in Sicily in the final years of his life. They are the questions that do not have final answers. They are the questions that each person has to answer for themselves, imperfectly, under whatever conditions they find themselves living in. Seneca's answers were imperfect. His life was imperfect. The distance between what he knew and how he lived was never fully closed. But the questions were right, and asking the right questions with enough persistence and enough honesty, even when you cannot live up to your own best answers, is not a small thing. It may be the thing. He was not the sage above the difficulty. Looking down at it with serene detachment, he was in it, with the rest of us, still thinking, still writing, still arguing with himself and with the world about what it meant to live well. Right up to the moment the argument ran out of time. That is the Seneca worth reading. Not the perfect Stoic of later mythology, not the hypocrite of easy dismissal. The man in the middle of his own contradictions, honest about the distance between the ideal and the actual, unwilling to pretend the distance does not exist, unwilling to stop trying to close it. Omnia aliena sunt. Tempus, tantum nostrum est, usually translated as everything is someone else's. Time alone is ours. He wrote that 2,000 years ago in a letter to a friend. As a man who understood what it cost to forget it, because he had paid that cost and kept an honest enough account to know exactly what it had amounted to. He wrote it, and the writing is still here. The question it carries is still open. What will you do with the time you have? That question is yours now. It always has been. Good night, and thank you for staying until the end.